All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this month's third Thursday. I'm happy to have this presentation on assessing household emergency preparedness in Hawaii by Dr. Albie Miles. Before we go to his presentation, I would like to give a shout out to Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, who is now moving away from NDPTC onto a new chapter in her life. And we want to congratulate her and wish her the best of life, best of luck. And we want to thank her for her great leadership, mentorship, and guidance while she was here at NDPTC, and we'll surely miss her.
Thank you, Kun. Very kind of you.
And now I'd like to pass on to Kirsten to introduce our speaker for today.
Oh, terrific. I love that this is my last act for NDPTC because Albie Miles is someone I've respected for years, and I'm delighted I get to introduce him. He is a transdisciplinary scholar and associate professor of sustainable community food systems at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu. His work is focused on advancing health, equity, resilience, and sustainability in the food system. But as you guys are certainly going to learn, it's going to become apparent in his talk today, Albie is also on a mission to help prepare Hawaii for disasters that may leave our islands in short supply of food, among other necessities. I met him soon after he arrived from UC Berkeley, where he received his PhD in environmental science, policy, and management. So he's well equipped to speak to this subject. Albie helped bring to our community in Hawaii the state and federal elected officials and Governor Ige's attention the critical state of our food system, which, because it operates on a just-in-time supply basis, could run out in a matter of days if we became cut off in a major disaster. So as a result, Albie has played an important advisory role for local and national food and agriculture policy and disaster preparedness. He's also been a good friend and given a lot of his free time to nonprofit organizations and to this mission outside of his teaching and research roles. So without further ado, take it away, Albie.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming to this presentation and discussion. Again, Albie Miles, Associate Professor of Sustainable Community Food Systems. And what I want to do today is I have some time for a presentation based on some research that we recently completed. I want to kind of step you through some context and some key findings, and then we can open it up for questions and answers. I'm assuming that the listening here is fairly diverse, but mostly people who are involved in planning and disaster preparedness in one way or another. So I'm going to be speaking really to the topic of household emergency preparedness based on our research, and more broadly, the concept of food system resilience. So I'm going to do screen share, we'll dive right into it, and then we'll open up for questions and answers. Okay, so let me just do this. Can you all see my screen? The wave? Okay, great. All right, so let's get into this. So first of all, it's important to acknowledge that I do most of this research in collaboration with both a friend and colleague, Konstantinos Zougros, who's a social science researcher and an expert in social science research methodology. And so Konstantinos and I designed and implemented this study over the last year. And as I mentioned, the manuscript is going through peer review. I'll circulate that peer-reviewed article once it reaches publication, but I believe I've already circulated our technical report, and I can circulate this PowerPoint presentation if that's helpful. So I want to first start with context, and most of you are aware of this, but I want to provide some context that helps us understand why Albie is so anxious and doesn't sleep at night when it comes to household preparedness and preparing for some eventual natural or human-caused disaster. So I'm going to be talking about some of the biophysical context, what we understand about climate destabilization, what we can anticipate over the remainder of this century, and then speaking to disaster preparedness in the context of poverty and household food insecurity, which can exacerbate the vulnerability of certain communities. And I'll spend a little bit of time talking about some pilot studies that we've done looking at the Port of Honolulu. We've done some of this in collaboration with private sector actors and the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency, and some of the other kind of critical forms of vulnerability in our food system that we should take into consideration when we're thinking about household preparedness. So very briefly, I'm just going to skim through some of this stuff, and you may have questions. And again, I'm happy to share any of this literature. I tend to reference lots of peer-reviewed literature when I give talks, and so I'm happy to direct you to any of this literature. So increasingly, very broadly, I'm very interested in global, national, and regional food system issues. And at the global level, what we're understanding is, the modern industrialized food system has been incredibly productive, right? We produce more food than we need at the global level, enough theoretically to feed every human being on this planet. However, the way that we have been producing food really since the Green Revolution, going back into the 1940s, is this increasingly industrialized model of production. And it comes with a significant amount of externalized costs in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, soil erosion, and so forth. And also the types of foods that we are increasingly producing, namely highly processed foods with lots of fat, salt, sugar, and so forth, lots of animal proteins. Collectively, the agri-food system is a major driver of global ecological change and negative public health externalities. Number one driver of global environmental change and negative public health externalities. And so increasingly the scientific community, you're seeing this kind of convergence of people like myself who have a background in ecology, environmental science, coming together with the public health epidemiology communities, pointing to the food system as this key driver of negative externalities, but also seeing the promise of the food system to deliver on the promotion of climate change adaptation and mitigation and improving public health and nutrition. So there's increasingly these calls for so-called food system transformation. And some of the research that I do is about generating policy relevant data so that our public policy decision makers, our leaders, from the governor on down through the state legislature, city, county people, can make informed decision about how to promote health, equity, resilience, and sustainability in the food system. So as you guys probably already know, there's been one IPCC report after another pointing to the advancement of climate destabilization. We're reaching the point of 1.5 degrees Celsius relative to the pre-industrial level. We're going to reach that, probably within the next couple of years. We seem to be always underestimating the rate of climate change. The current climate pledges are going to far exceed what is considered to be safe and maintain a stable climate of 1.5 degrees Celsius and below relative to the pre-industrial level. And the changes that we have already made to the climate system are baked in. Like, it's not going to go away. There is a certain amount of climate inertia, and that inertia is going to last for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So this is not something that's going to go away in the short term. And there's already predictions about severe humanitarian crises. A lot of this has to do with the impacts of severe weather events on commodity chains, creating food insecurity, malnutrition, and true hunger. Okay, and there's one report after another. This is not, I'll be making this stuff up. One report after another about the impact of climate destabilization or climate change on the US food system. And the impacts have been growing. And those of you who are, disaster preparedness people, I'm sure you're tracking this literature, perhaps not the food system literature so closely, but it's increasingly severe weather events are interfering with not only agricultural production, but the distribution of those goods from agriculture. And as we'll get into this a little bit later, as different crises unfold, say COVID-19 or economic crises, they tend to exacerbate some of these biophysical conditions. I just point this out because this is something that's very popularly conceived of in Hawaii, is that, we have a certain amount of vulnerability. The way that we're going to solve for this problem is to become entirely food self-sufficient. And I would say that, we consume far too much stuff that requires other forms of agriculture beyond Hawaii to really feed ourselves these days, and to be entirely food self-sufficient, which is really practically idealistic, impractically idealistic, because our local food production can also be impacted by climate destabilization and severe weather. So this is the North Shore of Kauai just a few years ago, where a lot of kalo is grown, a lot of starchy carbohydrates. A lot of that production was negatively impacted as a result of severe weather events. So I would argue what we should be directing our food system development toward is really an optimization of local agricultural production to serve social and ecological goals, economic development goals, and then also still being coupled with global commodity change, which is a form of redundancy that I'm going to speak to, which is a key component of resilience in the food system. Okay, let's keep going. And everybody's familiar with Hurricane Lane, right? If Hurricane Lane would have made landfall, many of our emergency management professionals said that, Hawaii would have looked something like Puerto Rico, right? And this is in the context of our really not being adequately prepared in terms of household storage or in-state storage of emergency food supplies. So I'm growing concerned about and trying to do relevant research to inform new policy decisions that are going to help promote greater resilience, because at some point there's going to be some other kind of shock to the system, whether it's another pandemic or it's a severe weather event like a hurricane. All of these things speak to the need for greater disaster preparedness. So what was driving the research that Konstantinos and I did is knowing that there's going to be future interruptions to the food supply, whether they're a physical shock like a hurricane or a socioeconomic shock, really like COVID-19, which is really an economic crisis that led to increased household food insecurity. We need to be thinking about how can we respond better, prepare and respond better. Okay, so a couple of last pieces of context, as Kirsten already mentioned. We're very geographically isolated, most geographically isolated population on the planet, have high levels of food import dependence, right? We have a just-in-time economy. This is an older slide, right? We're now approaching 1.5 million people, and the amount of food that we store in the state is really the food that's stored in the grocery store shelves, right? So we have somewhere 5 to 7 day supply of food. And if there is some severe weather event like a hurricane, as David Lopez has been educating us over the last few years at Hawai'i, is the Port of Honolulu tends to be shut down a day or two in advance. That means we're burning 2 days into our 5 to 7 day supply of food. And then if you have a significant event where there's down infrastructure, loss of energy, and so forth, then we can quickly burn through that 5 to 7 day supply of food. That could lead to a certain amount of either hunger and, in worst case scenarios, really social instability. Okay, a little bit more context, and then I'll get into the study. We already have fairly moderate to high rates of household food insecurity. And this is really important because there's different data sets that we draw upon in the social sciences to look at the rate of household food insecurity. And this is some older data, the number of 8 to 11%, that's USDA economic research data. 35.7%, that's Department of Health data. And then recently there was, and I'll show this in the next slide, is a study by the Hawaii Food Bank that has documented an estimated 30% of Hawaii households being food insecure in the last 12 months, with very high rates of food insecurity in the childhood population. So we're dealing with a certain amount of, chronic food insecurity upon which a natural disaster could occur. And it's consistently shown that those people who are already vulnerable in terms of socioeconomic positionality, they suffer the worst deprivation in the times of a crisis. And so, again, this is some context that informed the study that we were doing. As everybody knows, all of our critical infrastructure is on the south side of the island of Oahu, and we have very little levels of functional redundancy in terms of the food import system. And you guys probably know this much better than I, right? Where everybody thinks, oh, well, we'll just import food through the military port. right? As many people have said, the capacity of the military port is quite reduced relative to the port of Honolulu. Right? There's not a lot of in-state storage of emergency food or commercial food. And until recently, there hasn't been a lot of coordination between the private sector actors, people like Chad Buck and the Hawaii Food Service Alliance, and the emergency management agencies. That really started to happen in 2019 when I brought those two communities together. And since then, as many of you have watched in the popular media, Chad Buck has played a really important role, including in the Lahaina aftermath and feeding people who were suffering the consequences of that tragedy. So this just came out, and it's quite shocking. So Catherine Perkle, who's a faculty member at UH Manoa, worked with the Hawaii Food Bank to measure the rate of household food insecurity in Hawaii. And you can see on the data on the right, an estimated basically 1/3 of Hawaii's population. That varies slightly by island. And again, you can find this report online. 1/3 of the Hawaii population is experiencing some form of food insecurity. So if they're already food insecure, then those people, in the case of some kind of shock that may disrupt their ability to work, those are the people who really can become vulnerable in the case of some kind of natural disaster. So again, this is just context to help us understand how and why we should be better prepared and the means by which we become prepared. The number is relatively similar. Households with children, it's about 28% across the state. So a lot of children are living in households that are food insecure. Okay, and a little bit of additional context, right? We did some studies looking at if this is where all the food and other critical supplies flows through the port of Honolulu. In the case of a category 3 and above, the level of inundation is going to influence the overwhelming majority of the critical infrastructure at the port of Honolulu, including energy substations and so on and so forth. And, just with static sea level rise toward the end of the century, increasingly this area is going to be inundated with flooding, and that doesn't take into account storm surge. So we need to be thinking about how do we store food in the state, whether or not households are actually prepared for a natural disaster in order to make sure that we can respond in an active way to some kind of interruption. So enter the concept of food system resilience. Food system resilience is really, is the system upon which we are dependent for our food, is it capable of responding to a shock and returning back to a steady state after that shock? And there's a range of different factors that influence our ability to go from the current state, the flat line there on the left-hand side, the current level of food availability. And as we just showed, 1/3 of the state of Hawaii, the population, is already food insecure. So in the case of a disaster, then you have a drop in the rate of food availability or the rate of household food security. And it's going to take some time for that to recover. And that has to do with our disaster preparedness, has to do with our emergency response system, has to do with the recovery in terms of the economy. And just to kind of put an example on this, we see this from the Great Economic Recession. So if you go just before 2010, right, you see an increased rate of household food insecurity. This is USDA economic research data. That's the Great Economic Recession. That's simply people losing their jobs because there was a contraction in the US economy. And then as the economy recovered going toward 2020, you see a decline, slow decline in the rate of household food insecurity as people were regaining employment and able to have more disposable income. And then you get to 2020, and what happens? The COVID-19 pandemic. Again, an economic contraction because of people not being able to go to work, all the lockdowns that happened, and therefore household income contracted and people became food insecure. So I'm mentioning this simply because it can be a physical shock to a system like a hurricane, destroying infrastructure and harming people and so forth, but it can also be a socioeconomic shock to the system, and it takes time to recover. But the rate of recovery, as you guys know, as scholars of this stuff, depends on a number of factors. And what I was honing in on is if components of resilient include redundancy, then we should be thinking about the ways that we can build redundancy relatively efficiently into the system. So there's a growing academic literature, some of which I've contributed to, these special editions on food system resilience, and they're all pointing to a similar thing, and that is we need to have people be aware of the risks. We have to build functional redundancy in the system, and we have to make sure that people are able to prepare and take care of themselves for some period of time following a natural disaster. So food system resilience is this capacity of the food system to provide adequate amounts of food to basically maintain food security in the case of various biophysical, social, or economic disturbances. Okay, so these are the things that I'm really going to focus on. So the literature that's growing up around this concept of food system resilience include these 9 major characteristics. I'm really going to just be touching on these ones that are highlighted in red around awareness and preparedness, diversity in the sources of food, that there's redundancy in the sources of food, and then there's connectivity between different components of the food system. And so I'll mention mostly about awareness and then diversity and redundancy from this point. But again, lots of literature that's emerging around food system resilience, and happy to share that with you as once we wrap up. Okay, so as mentioned, we're a remote island population, and household emergency preparedness is one key way that functional redundancy in terms of food supply can be built. Because as most of you know who've been working in emergency management and disaster preparedness, is the state of Hawaii, whether at the city county level or at the state level, we don't store a lot of food. We don't store a lot of food commercially. Ha'ima has a very limited supply of emergency food that's not exclusively dedicated to the population of Hawaii, as I understand it. And neither Ha'ima or the city county stores emergency food. So in the case of a natural disaster, when the emergency management agencies aren't in a position to really distribute food, then we need to make sure that we have households that are prepared to take care of themselves for a certain period of time. And that's the, as I understand it, that is the root cause of the policy recommendation from the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency to have that 14-day supply of food, water, and essential medicine, because the state or the city county cannot take care of everybody in the case of a natural disaster. So that's, if that is, again, the origin of this 14-day supply of food and water. I was having a conversation with David Lopez, and I said, what's the rate? How many people in the state of Hawaii actually have achieved that 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine? And he said that he didn't know, and that they didn't have an active research project to measure that. So I said, oh, guess what? I do research, so I can begin measuring that for you. So Konstantinos and I set forward the process of articulating a research project. And again, we're focusing really on, this phases of emergency management. We're talking about preparedness and response, because we believe that if you have households with that 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine, then they're prepared and they can take care of themselves and be less dependent upon the emergency management agencies in terms of a response to the critical period. And then, of course, recover much more quickly. Okay, so this is what we were really focused on. We wanted to examine a couple of things, and this is, I'll go through this slowly so that we don't get confused about the terminology. So our study examines the differences between perceived and actual household preparedness, and detects the factors explaining the extent of households' actual preparedness, and predicts the likelihood of households' readiness in Hawaii. Okay, so let's break that down. What we mean by perceived preparedness is we just asked people the generic question: do you believe that you're prepared for a natural disaster? And then we got the response of, oh yeah, we're prepared for a natural disaster, no problem. And then we actually measured, well, tell us exactly what you have in your house, so that we can determine whether or not you've met that 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine. Okay, and that those who have realized that 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine, those are the households that we consider to be ready, to be household readiness, okay? So we found, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, is we found a significant difference between households that believed that they were prepared and their actual level of preparedness. Okay, a significant difference. So when asked the generic question, is your household prepared for a natural disaster? Overwhelmingly, people were like, yes, yeah, we're prepared. And then we asked them a series of follow-up questions, and then lo and behold, actually very few, and to be specific, 12% of households statewide were actually prepared relative to that 14-day standard of food, water, and essential medicine. Okay, so we're going to be looking at perceived preparedness and then actual preparedness in Hawaii. And it's all relative to the Hawaii Emergency Management Standard, which is a 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine. We'll be also referencing the FEMA standard, which is the 7-day supply of food, water, and essential medicine. And then, of course, what are the factors that prevented people or enabled people to realize those kind of goals? Okay, we'll keep going, and then we can ask clarifying questions. Okay. So again, perceived preparedness is self-reported level of household preparedness that when we ask them, hey, are you prepared for a natural disaster? Actual preparedness is the extent in terms of the number of days of food, water, and medicine supplies that were stored in a household, okay? And so the readiness is, what percentage of households actually realize that 14-day supply of essential food, water, and medicine. Okay, and we define these categories of water ready, food ready, and medicine ready. Okay, so let's dig into this, and feel free to write down questions in the chat, and we can revisit this when we get to the end. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but we designed a survey instrument, as all researchers have to do when they're doing social science research. It goes through the human subjects research process and is authorized, and we got the authorization. We deployed the survey instrument, which was about 20 questions that went out statewide. We made sure that there was representation across all the counties in Hawaii. The total number of participants exceeded 1,006 households. So we got a representative sample across the state of Hawaii. And this is the first statewide survey that we are aware that has ever been done. So we got a representational sample across all of the state of Hawaii. So 1,006 households. It was all done digitally or electronically. It was an online survey instrument. And we were looking, in terms of the survey design, we're looking at those key factors, measuring perceptions of risk, their actual preparedness and perceived preparedness, how they want to learn about disaster preparedness information, and then we collected some socio-demographic information so that we could begin to categorize some of these households into groups. So we could say, oh, well, it seems like this particular socio-demographic group are particularly vulnerable. Therefore, the outreach and communication efforts really need to be targeted at these particularly vulnerable and poorly prepared communities. Okay, so jumping to the key findings, and this is, I think, quite shocking, is you see across the bottom it says water supply, food supply, and medicine supply, right? Okay, and so then we broke it down into, were they FEMA ready or HYEMA ready? And the FEMA ready is 7-day supply of food, water, and medicine, right? And then HYEMA ready is a 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine. So when we asked people, are you ready in terms of a water supply? 71% of the households, the respondents, said, oh, yeah, we're ready. And then we asked them a series of questions. Could you tell us a little bit about the water that you actually have stored? And then that actual preparedness dropped to 42%. And then when we asked them, well, do you have enough water really for 14 days? And please substantiate in these ways. Then the actual preparedness relative to the HYEMA, the 14-day standard, dropped down to 19%. Okay, so you guys get this? There's a significant difference between people when asked the generic question, are you prepared for a natural disaster? Overwhelmingly, they say yes. and that's across that's across water, food, and medical supplies. You see that in the red rectangles. But as we ask them a series of questions, please substantiate the amount of water, food, and medicine that you have, the numbers begin to diminish significantly. So there's a misperception of people's preparedness relative to their actual level of preparedness or readiness for a natural disaster. Does that make sense? And just give me a thumbs up if I'm being clear. Okay, let's keep going. So that's the key. That's one key finding is perceived preparedness versus readiness. There's a significant delta or differential. Okay, so we broke it down by county. Again, this is perceived preparedness, but actually not being ready. And then those who perceive themselves to be prepared and then were actually prepared. So again, significant difference between those who perceived themselves to be prepared and those who were actually prepared by county. So that is some of the key findings is we need to make sure that people who are aware of the recommendations to prepare for 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine, and they actually know how to do that. So one of the other key findings is there was a significant number of people who had never even heard of this stuff. They responded, oh, I don't know anything about this 7-day supply or 14-day supply of food. Many people who are aware of the recommendation by the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency, they were operating on the old recommendation. They had approximately a 7-day supply of food because that's what they understood. They didn't realize that recommendation had been updated. I think it was in 2018, if I recall correctly. So overall, in terms of households being fully ready with a 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine as recommended by the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency, 88% of households surveyed were not prepared. They may have been partially prepared. That's important. They may have had that 7-day supply of food, water, and medicine. But in terms of actually meeting that 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine, which is what the Hawaii Emergency Management Agency is asking of us, then there's very small numbers of households who actually have realized that. Okay, so kind of summarize some other key findings. The actual preparedness significantly varies across levels of perceived preparedness, right? So that we have a lot of people who perceive themselves to be prepared, but they're not very well prepared. The households who conceived of themselves as being very well prepared had 7 days, about 9 days, and almost 10 days of water, food, and medical supplies stored respectively. Okay, so the people who perceive themselves to be prepared, they were a bit more prepared than many of the other households that claim that they weren't prepared at all or were not aware of the policy recommendation at all. However, even if they perceived themselves to be very prepared, they were only meeting about half of the recommendation. Does that make sense? That even if they conceived themselves of being very well prepared, they underestimated how much they needed to supply to be prepared relative to that 14-day standard that Hawaii Emergency Management has put forward. So that's what this last bullet point is really about, is, the perceived preparedness is not a proxy for household readiness. That is, there's a difference between those who even say that they are very prepared for a natural disaster and actually realizing that 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine. Okay, so let's get into a couple of other details in terms of the grouping. So we're, of course, categorizing all of these different respondents into different groups. And what we did find is those people who were familiar with the FEMA and the HAIMA guidelines for storing essential food, water, and medicine, if they were aware of those recommendations, they were more likely to be prepared. So that has, I think, communication implications. Those people who are aware of the recommendations tend to be more prepared. So that means we should probably do a better job of attempting to reach people because that stimulates them to become better prepared. They may not have realized that 14-day supply. However, they tend to be more prepared and store more essential food, water, and medicine. Okay. those people who, the second bullet point in green is public awareness of the HAIMA updated guidelines. That means that those people who were familiar that HAIMA had upped their numbers from a 7-day supply of food, water, and medicine to a 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine were 82% more likely to be fully prepared. Okay, so again, if people are aware of the policy recommendation, they tend to be more prepared. And if they are aware of this updated guidelines, then they were even more prepared. Okay. Let's see. Ports of essential supply storage. Those who were this is kind of reiterating some of the details above, but if they had information on what was actually being recommended by HAIMA, they tended to be more likely to be prepared, meaning if they had accessed those guidelines that said you need this and this and this types of food, water, and medicine. There's some very simple guidelines for people to follow, as opposed to a generic recommendation of store food, water, and medicine. If they received specific guidelines, they were more likely to be prepared. Those people who had in our survey responded and said they had some concerns about city, county emergency management agencies or the Hawaii emergency management agencies, and they believed that they needed to do a quote better job. Those populations who had a little bit of kind of criticism of the emergency management agencies, they tended to be more prepared. Kind of oddly enough, people who had pets in their household seemed to be more prepared. And then you can see here for the years of residence, county of residence, and yeah, I think there's some interesting implications, especially, people who've resided here for a longer period of time have gone through different warnings around a potential crisis. Those who are on Hawaii Island, right, who have received more direct hits from hurricanes and so forth, they tend to be a little bit more prepared. And then we see some patterns in terms of ethnicity. Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders tend to be a little bit more prepared. And then females tend to be more prepared than male head of households. Okay. So in summary, and then we can kind of open this up for questions and answers. 12%, only 12% of households had that full 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine. That's a very low percentage as far as I'm concerned. I haven't compared that to other statewide studies, but to me that seems very, very low given our geography and high rates of food insecurity. So there's a significant difference between actual preparedness and the levels of perceived preparedness. So we need to do a better job of communicating that. There are a fair number of households that do meet that FEMA standard, that 7-day supply of food, water, and medicine, which is going to be certainly helpful. But if our goal is to reach a 14-day supply of essential supplies stored at the household level, then we need to do a better job of promoting and helping people realize that objective. Those who are aware of the HAIMA guidelines were more prepared than households who are not aware. Again, I think it has communications implications. And then there are certain characteristics that we just reviewed that tend to be more prepared. So the Pacific Islander community, female head of households, and so forth. So those perhaps have implications for if we can get Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander leaders to help educate their community members, and perhaps more households would be prepared. If we can get more female head of households to communicate to other households, we can perhaps get better prepared. So communications, I believe, is one of the key recommendations. So in summary here, and then I'll shut up, is I believe we need to do a far better job at communicating to make sure that more people are aware of the HAIMA 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine recommendations. People need very specific guidelines on how to do that, and perhaps there needs to be some kind of incentive process instated so that household, particularly those who are of limited resource, who cannot afford to feed their families well on a regular basis, they have some means by which they can gain access to adequate amounts of food for storage, because that's one of the things that is very commonly responded to in our survey. Is the reason that they don't have that 14-day supply is because it's difficult and expensive, or they don't have the storage space, right? So there's a range of factors in the household that are preventing people from executing on these recommendations. One thing I think that is important is because the city and county and the state do not store emergency food. I think that that's something that the state of Hawaii should be considering, because we have only commercial food, very little emergency food stored, with the exception of FEMA. And then we seem to have very low levels of household storage. So having some additional centralized emergency food storage, perhaps through some kind of vendor managed inventory system, like you have an organization like the Hawaii Food Service Alliance. It could be contracted, because they do emergency food distribution. They could be contracted to store a certain amount of emergency food in state. We could do things like have these emergency food pods, like have been installed in, the Waianae Coast Comprehensive Health Center. So we're working on this food pod system. There needs to be other forms of in-state emergency food storage, and they can be various models for that. And there just needs to be better coordination between the public sector agencies, HAIMA, FEMA, and city, county, and firms like the Hawaii Food Service Alliance. I'm referring to Chad Buck's organization that did a remarkable job in the case of the Lahaina wildfires, when the state and the city county couldn't step in as quickly. So those are some general recommendations: communications, pre-positioning of emergency food, increased amount of in-state food storage, and then some coordination between public and private sector. So I will pause there. I've been chatting at you for far too long, but I will open up for questions and answers. And I see there's about 7 questions in the chat, so we can perhaps start with those. So thank you for your time. I appreciate it. And again, I'm happy to circulate some of the PowerPoint in our technical report if necessary. So I'm going back up, unless Kirsten, unless you want to go through these, if you want to read these questions. Otherwise,
Yeah, Kung is going to do that. There's some good questions in here and some good discussion. So Kung, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dr. Miles, for that excellent presentation. And this is highly relevant research to Hawaii, and especially during hurricane season, but also relevant to our neighbors in the Pacific and the Atlantic region. So if you have a question, please place it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself to answer your question. I'll go down the list of questions in chat first. The first one is from Cyrene. When the COVID-19 stay-at-home orders were issued by the state, there was no food or emergency debit card supplied, though low-income Hawaii residents in sectors like day labor and home childcare stopped being paid that day. Were there any meetings or even change to now offer something in preparation of an ask?
It's a great question and a great strategy. And I think that that's something that, we'll see as the political landscape shifts at the federal level, likely. But I think having a debit card where emergency funds can be more rapidly distributed so that people could gain access to foods when their, household income bottoms out, I think is an excellent idea. And that's a big initiative, but I do think you're right on the money, Serene, in terms of that being a key mechanism by which food security can be maintained when household income drops, which is the principal driver of household food insecurity. So I don't know that any of those conversations were being had, but that had been some of the solutions that were taking place. Is, some of our local foundations were pumping money to farmers so that they could contribute to emergency food distribution, and not lose a significant amount of money in the process. So you need to kind of pump a certain amount of money into the system in order to maintain food security, and providing it directly to the households, as was done at the federal level with some of this federal stimulus, during COVID-19, when there was a big economic contraction, right? You actually saw a reduction in childhood poverty in the middle of a significant crisis. And so I think you're on the money, but I don't know that that has been moved toward operationalization, but it is a good idea. I'll stop there.
And we have an excellent
Thank you.
comment from Karen. And she expressed that sometimes people do know that they have to be prepared for 14 days, but they're stopped by various barriers, such as not being able to buy additional food or not having enough food storage in their homes. That's an excellent comment, Karen.
Yep. Yeah, and I'll respond to that and say that. So what we found in terms of, I didn't get into this in my little presentation, but it was don't have the money, don't have the space, right? And so how can I be expected to, store 14 days supply of food when I'm already struggling, right? So if the state of Hawaii wants people to be prepared, then there needs to be one, better communication, that this is a high priority to make sure that households are prepared, and perhaps there needs to be some kind of incentive. And there are some, not that one would want to eat them on a regular basis, but there are some emergency food kits that can be purchased, and they can be purchased at scale and, at a discounted rate, just so that households do have something in the case of a disaster. That's something that the state could incentivize. So that, in addition to pre-positioning of a certain number of emergency food pods in communities where we know that there are high rates of food insecurity and high rates of either poverty or limited income communities, because those communities cannot be expected to store that 14-day supply of food, water, medicine. So there's multiple strategies, but I think you're on the right track there. It's unrealistic, and so there has to be some kind of strategy put forward to make that a realistic goal.
And we have a question from Kirsten. Why do you think Hawaii Island was better prepared than the others?
Yeah, I think I mentioned that very briefly. Is we believed that because of the higher frequency of direct hits of hurricanes and the natural dynamism of the Big Island, with volcanic eruptions and so forth, that people may be better prepared because of those histories of disturbances. So that is what we were assuming is the case. We didn't ask that in terms of follow-up questions, but that's what is our operating assumption.
I think there was some good discussion there, though, in answer to my question. And Serene pointed out one interesting one is the distance, and people stock up with Costco because they can't afford local food stores. So one interesting thing might be to look at the food deserts and how we respond to that for affordable food. But I know that gets into some of the weeds of what you presented in the context.
Yeah, the geographic isolation from a major food source, and so people tend to shop for 3 or 4 weeks as opposed to shop for 3 or 4 days, right?
Yeah.
Got it.
And one of the things that I was surprised is that Kauai was so low because of Hurricane Iniki. One would think that that would be higher, and because of the regular flooding and the fact that the North Shore is cut off all the time, that there would be at least at that pocket above Princeville that would have a much higher incidence of preparedness. Did you find any pockets like that?
That may have been the case, but we weren't really sampling specific pockets where there was a higher frequency of natural disasters. I would imagine we could substantiate that through a follow-up study, but your intuition is likely correct that those communities who have higher rates of disturbances, right, have figured out means by which they respond, and they tend to be more resilient communities, and particularly in the North Shore of Kauai. I would assume your assumption is correct, but we need to kind of pen that out. But we didn't gather additional data in those little pockets to substantiate that is the case.
And we have a question from Linda. Health insurance companies won't prescribe additional meds for 14-day storage. Are there any efforts to lobby the industry to allow for this, especially for seniors?
Yeah, Linda, that's one of the things we actually discovered in this process. I didn't realize that. So there's certain, I guess, many medications, and I'm no expert on this, but there's many medications that the insurers will simply not supply you with a 14-day supply of. And I actually have a close friend who's a diabetic, and he says that they're always running him, down to the very last a vial of medicine before he is renewed. And that spells a disaster. So to me, that would make a very strong policy recommendation to see what some of our, elected officials can do to modify those terms of agreement with some of the insurers, because you could imagine in the case of a severe disaster, then supply chains could be down for many, many weeks, if not months. And so people who are dependent upon insulin or dialysis and so forth, you could see that there would be a lot of members of our community with chronic illness that would be severely compromised. So I don't know what's happening in terms of follow up on lobbying the industry, but I think that's a very, very important structural obstacle to realizing greater resilience in the system. So great question. I'm sorry I don't have additional details on what could be done, but I think it's important to talk to some of our elected officials about what could be done to build that kind of resilience.
There is a great deal of data out there that shows that those are the very people who are the first to perish in the disasters, post-disaster. And yeah, there needs to be a great deal done on that.
I'm seeing a question from Noriko, I'm sorry.
I don't see that question, but could you say it,
And-
Albie?
Oh, it comes directly to me. So it says, I recently joined Hawai'i as a planner. Thank you for the presentation. Oh, she wants a copy. I'd like to show. Okay, got it. I can do. Wasn't a question. I apologize.
And we have a question from Mary. I think it's related to food storage. Expiration dates on food can be an issue on food storage.
Yes, of course it can. There's certain foods, right, that are much more perishable than others. And the emergency food pod that Chad Buck sponsored for the Waianae Coast Comprehensive Health Center, I think there's 125,000 meals in there, right? And those meals, I am sure they do not pair very well with white Burgundy wine. However, it will feed you in the case of a disaster, and they are 25 years shelf stable. So there are things that have been developed that are quite stable. Again, they might not be palatable, but there are kits, and I think you can even buy them off of the Amazon and other major retailers, where they come in a 5-gallon bucket, and it's for a household of 4, and it's for a 14-day supply of food. Of course, you can need to figure out the water component of that, but there are these little kits that can be purchased at a relatively cheap price. And then I will say that I think the folks at Kapiolani Community College, there's a couple of folks who are interested in kind of disaster preparedness and resilience, and they've been trying to figure out what would be some ways that those who are handy and thrifty in the kitchen can prepare some of their own foods for some kind of natural disaster kit. Yeah, if that's right. Offering classes, yes, that would be great. It'd be great little kind of extension course, like preparing for natural disaster. I think that's a great idea, whether it's do it yourself with your own food or just helping people actually understand this is what a 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine looks like. Because I think many people, receive that recommendation of the 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine, and then they have a hard time translating that into reality. So having very concrete examples, and I know there's some resources on the HIEMA website, but I think that is not adequate. I think we need to do a better job of really holding people's hand to get them to boost their level of household preparedness. Let's see, some kits give a false security of being prepared because what's in there is not very helpful. Okay, that's Karine is making that comment. And I think Noriko has put in a link to everyone, and I'm just opening that up right now. I don't know, Noriko, you want to just describe why you put that in there, just so everybody has a sense. Okay. Let's see, we're at 12:55, so we have a few more minutes. Again, I will offer that you can I'm just going to put my email into the chat so you can reach out to me, and it's albie@hawaii.edu. So feel free to write to me, and I will provide the hosts of this event with the technical report and the PowerPoint presentation, and then our peer-reviewed article will be coming out shortly. And my aim is to really get the city, county, state to do much more communications in promoting disaster preparedness and this realizing this 14-day supply of food, water, and medicine. So if you want to speak with me about that, or you have contacts to people in the city and state government where we can, hopefully provide some encouragement, I'm happy to work with you on that.
And Albie, I have one question for you. You said that Ha'ima doesn't have the infrastructure for emergency food storage for Hawaii. Do you know of any examples for other states or counties that have a food storage for their community?
I haven't really studied other states. But many other states, they don't necessarily need to have the same level of capacity because they have interstate highways and railroad systems and robust agricultural sectors from which emergency supplies can flow. We have none of that. And so there's a certain amount of storage that's built in. I'm originally from California. You have a large population with a very robust agriculture and all these transportation networks, and here it's very, very limited. So I think it speaks to the unique need for Hawaii to have more storage. So I don't know other case studies where they have robust storage. I don't really work in emergency management. I just did a research project to kind of help the emergency management agencies understand the state of play with regard to household emergency preparedness.
Thank you. Does anyone have any last minute questions before we end today?
No, I just encourage everyone to spread the word and to do all you can through your organizations and networks to support preparedness. So, and thank you, Albie. You've been a fantastic presenter, as we knew you would. We really appreciate you sharing your research and also your email. I'm sure lots of folks will follow up with you.
Oh, happy to. Yep. And there's some interesting films, if you haven't seen it, there's a documentary film called Ketchup and M&Ms that kind of documents some of these conversations. Kuleana, I think it was PBS, the program called Kuleana. We did that with Chad Buck and some filmmakers, again, trying to help people understand the nature of disaster preparedness in Hawaii. So Ketchup and M&Ms and the Kuleana series on emergency preparedness would both be good films that could be easily circulated to some of your community members and networks.
Well, thank you, Albie, for presenting to us today, and thank you all for joining us for this month's Third Thursday. I'll be sure to send the recording, Albie's presentation, and the technical report to you all today. To you all in a future email. Next month's webinar, we'll feature Suzanne Fiu, and she will be talking about equity and cultural competency in emergency management. So hope to see you all next month. Oh, Mary, you raised your hand for one comment, question.
I know this may seem kind of silly, but who would be the closest island or location to you to have some kind of a memorandum of understanding type of thing? Anybody that you could coordinate with that would be there for you off island?
I'm not sure. Who is that question directed toward?
Anybody who could answer that. You,
So you're asking, I'm not totally clear on the question. If you could repeat that.
If
Are
I
there
may,
any-
I'll try and chime in. And this is really, we have folks from Hawai'i, I believe, on the call. But there are some agreements in place between states via FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and via the Department of Defense and both the state level and the federal level. And so, yes, there are emergency teams that are prepared to come in and support. But in terms of the storage, that is not something that I'm aware of, and we'd all, if anyone from Hawai'i wants to chime in.
Would it be a good idea to get something like that in place?
Sounds like it.
Because it would seem to me that part of the response would be to make sure you have food.
Yeah, and that's what, if I'm understanding, at least part of your question and comment is that second URL that I dropped into the chat. I dropped two. One is to the filmmaker who did the film Ketchup and M&Ms, and all the, David Lopez and other people are interviewed. Chad Buck is interviewed, and the second one is more recent, and it's again about preparing for disasters and the important role that the private sector can play in collaboration with the state agencies to make sure that food is distributed in the case of a disaster. Because if FEMA and the state and city county do not store and do not have the infrastructure and transportation infrastructure to get things from point A to point B, but the private sector does, and they do it 24/7, we should probably have a memoranda to make sure that the things can get from point A to point B through the private sector. So anyhow, some of that is mentioned in the second video called Kuleana.
Thank you.
All right, I'm gonna go. Good to see you all. Kirsten, good to see you. Thank you, team, for hosting me, and pleasure to see you all. I'll look forward to some of your emails.
Thank you, Albie.
Aloha, everyone.
Aloha.
Bye-bye.